So
thank you so much. Who's next? Sharing our names, your role, you're in what program, and a little bit about your research interests.
Yeah, I can go next. My name is Alexander Pittman. I'm a first-year doctoral student in teaching and learning in the MESI program. My research interest is in how Black, I should say, males of color, adolescent males of color develop their academic identity, how they see themselves fitting in to K through 12 education, but my background is in high school teaching, so really in secondary education. And then also if there's any correlation between the development of the academic identity and the lack of African-American male professors at major universities. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice. Nice to meet you. Welcome to Ohio. Yeah. Who's next?
I can go. Hi, I'm Chelsea. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a first year doctoral student in higher education and student affairs, and I'm interested in broadly critical approaches to trauma in higher education, and specifically how trauma might look different based on identity. So happy to be here. And I do have to turn off my camera at some point so that I can make my lunch, but I'm excited to be a part of the conversation.
I can go next. So my name is Sydney. I am actually just a first year master's student, so I do not have a research project yet. However, I was involved in undergrad with Onia Okawobi doing a study and coding interviews for her related to like racial battle fatigue and also like utilization of folks of color in workspaces. And like how, were they followed up, were they used to fill a quota? Like we were looking into all that through qualitative interviews. So we were interviewing pastors, healthcare workers, and those that are in academia, like assistant professors. So that was a really fantastic experience that I had in undergrad, and I hope that I can use that to develop some of the work that I do now that I'm in master's.
Yes, I can go next. So my name is Jonathan Howe. I'm a third year doctoral candidate in the higher ed student affairs program. My research interests are primarily looking at Black male student athlete identity and identity development. I'm a Black male student athlete, but also look at racial diversity within college athletics as well.
I can go. My name is Amari Dryden. I'm a first year master's student in the higher education and student affairs program. My GA is in the career counseling and support services office, and research interests that I haven't actually even done yet, but is working with Native American students and their experiences in higher education, and then also student athletes and helping them in their transition from high school to college to a career.
I can go next. I'm also a my name's Charlie. I'm also a first year master's student in the HESA program. And I don't quite have a research interest yet, but I'm in Penny's class and we're narrowing that down right now. So hopefully soon I'll have a research interest coming.
I guess we're doing introductions.
Yes, Rosita, we are. We're doing name, your role, and then a word or two about your research, and it's really nice to see you.
Yes, it's nice to be seen and not viewed, as my grandmother would say. I'm Rhodesia, and I am a postdoc here in EHE. I am in the Educational Studies Department, specifically Education Policy. I'll be working with QualLab regarding in vivo training, and my research looks at policy and how it either creates and or exacerbates pre-existing inequitable conditions for students with disabilities as well as students of color. grades K through 12 to be specific. So I'm not higher ed.
I think all right, I will assume it's my turn. My name is Tatiana Suspitsina. I'm Associate Professor in Higher Education Student Affairs Program. It's great to see some of the far advanced folks like Jonathan and Bakari and E, whom I haven't seen in a while. My research interests relate to primarily discourse analysis of different kinds and in application to internationalization. From a critical perspective, from a critical post-colonial and post-structuralist perspective. And also, that also connects to larger issues of policy and American position taking in the market of educational services, in the global market of educational services. I'm very excited to be here. Qualitative lab is something that appeared in my dreams many times in my time at OSU. I think it's a great start. It's a great initiative. And Penny, I welcome you and I salute you because we have such a, we have a strong presence of quantitative methods, and qualitative methodologies have been always a kind of an afterthought in many, I shouldn't say courses, but in programs. And I think having a center where people can come and talk and leaf through their data collection analysis is just amazing. It's going to be an amazing space.
Thank you so much. I think Alexander,
Yes.
Would you like to introduce yourself, or just I think just going to, oh, you are.
Yeah, I was gonna say I did. I'm sorry, I had to stop my video for a second, but
you were good. I just didn't want to forget anybody. I'm so glad you did, and you kicked it off earlier. Thank you.
yeah, no problem at all. No problem.
Thank you. Jen, we welcome. We just went around and all shared our name, where we are from in our program, and a short word or two about your research interests, if you would like.
Sure. I'm gonna keep my video off because I am not dressed properly. I'm Jen Wong. I'm an associate professor in human sciences. And so I'm predominantly trained as a quantitative person, but I've just gotten into more in terms of qualitative research. And so I'm just really interested in learning what this group has to offer.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. We are so glad that you're here. So we are going to quickly share the introduction of our fabulous speaker. So I am going to toggle through and quickly, hopefully, do, there we go, housekeeping. So we just, little housekeeping, keep your microphone off, your video welcome to be on or off, whatever you would like. And I'd like to, I'm so glad that we were able to do introductions. Hey, see what happens when you use somebody else's marketing gave me this template. So we are going to do welcome and housekeeping, and then an introduction of our fabulous speaker. So here we are. I'm going to turn it over to Bakari, and Bakari is going to do the welcome and introduction.
Absolutely. So first off, thank you everyone for coming out and being here with us here virtually here this afternoon for our QualLab Lunch series. I'm going to be introducing Dr. Kwame Agyemang. He is an associate professor of sports management in the Department of Human Services. Prior to arriving at The Ohio State University, he served 7 years at Louisiana State University under promotion and tenure in 2018, and 1 year at Eastern Kentucky University as an assistant professor. He also spent the spring 2019 quarter as a visiting professor at UC Davis Graduate School of Management. As a leader in the area of organizations and racial justice, Dr. Agyemang has consulted both professional athletes and professional sports organizations on topics on race and leading social change in the community. His upcoming book, under contract with Cornell University and IOR Press, examines and explains how organizations can support and positively impact underserved populations. He highlights the work of the National Basketball Association and its member organizations. Dr. Agyemang has published 30 peer-reviewed journal articles in various journals, including the Journal of Management Inquiry, Journal of Sports Management, Sports Management Review, Journal of African American Studies, International Journal of Sport Management, and International Review of the Sociology of Sport, among others. He is also the deputy editor for Sport Business Management and International Journal, and serves on several editorial boards, including Sociology of Sport Journal, International Journal of Sport Communication, Journal of Amateur Sport, and International Journal of Sport Management. So without further ado, Dr. Kwame Agyemang.
Well, thanks for having me, y'all. I'm going to share my screen as well. Let's see. Can you all see that? Okay. All right, so yeah, let me turn that off. All right, so yeah, thank you all. Thanks for that introduction, Bakari. Thanks for having me. I didn't know I was kicking off this series, so I guess pressure, right? But today we'll be talking about a topic that's important to me, that I've done research on dating back to 2010 when my original papers during my PhD, and that's athlete activism. So as Bakari mentioned, I'm associate professor here. I'm in my second year here as an associate professor after spending 7 years at Louisiana State University. So thank you all again for inviting me for this important conversation. So to begin, I'm going to give kind of a background of my research influences and my research agenda, kind of give you basically an understanding of how I came to this topic of athlete activism and how this fits within my overall research agenda. Then we'll get into the brief presentation of the topic. So I would say that my academic training in 3 different areas has really contributed a lot to my my research agenda. So I did my undergrad in political science at the University of Oklahoma, and this really gave me an understanding of social policy, institutions. I utilize institutional theory in a lot of my research, and I combine that with critical race theory and understanding of the issues that I research, and also gave me an understanding of how governments affect people, right, and how in turn people can impact government and policy, hence the notion of athlete activism. And then transitioned to higher education administration at the University of Oklahoma, same program that Penny taught in for many years. And we had a focus on intercollegiate athletics administration, and I was in that program. So this provided me understanding of theories and concepts related to organizational behavior, and in addition to other issues, particularly as it relates, of course, to the college and university setting. Then went on to Texas A&M University, where I studied sport management for my PhD. This gave me more research competency while also better understanding the business and social aspects of the spectator sport industry. So this has all contributed to my research, and in the most broadest terms, it's at the intersection of sports business and society. But in particular, I'm interested in questions related to agents such as athlete activism, activists, institutions, and institutional change. And again, I rely upon institutional theory, which is an organizational theory utilized a lot in among sociology scholars, management scholars, amongst a host of others, and then critical race theory, which I was introduced to by my PhD advisor at Texas A&M. So to better understand my research questions, as you can see right there, I studied the norms within organizations, systems, and institutions. So to kind of give you a little snapshot of some of the things that I've worked on in my past. So my work resides within a number of different levels of analysis. So for instance, at the macro level, a paper that I recently is in press right now, got accepted, looks at the institutional level. When we think about notions of institutional racism and racialized policies and laws, and we examine the sport industry. So if you look at the sport industry, right, if you look on the field, in particular Black football and basketball, we particularly see Black men. But you go higher up, you don't see that many people that look like myself. So for instance, in the NBA, one of the organizations I study a lot, and my book is on, there's only one owner that's of color, and that's Michael Jordan, right? And then in the NFL, I think there's one person of color, Indian owner for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And even below that, when we think about the C-suite positions, executives, they're mostly white. And we argue in this paper, a lot of this has to do with the whole notion of unpaid internships, which we examine in this paper. Think about myself, I couldn't work an unpaid internship during the summer. And the people that could are more likely to be white, come from privilege and have money. So they have that on their resume. And then all of a sudden they're able to get these jobs and they move up the ladder in the corporate world, as opposed to people like myself and other people of color. Maybe we can get an internship at the local high school because that's all we can afford, because our parents can afford to pay to go off to LA or to New York to work at the NBA league office or something of that sort. So we argue that this is the reason for the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in the sport industry when we think about the C-suite. I've also done research at the meso organizational level when we think about individual organizations within sports, and the experiences of workers, Black workers, people of color workers, the experiences of Black male athletes in schools. One of my papers, I think it's my most often cited paper, deals with the experiences of Black athletes in college athletics and their whole, I guess they're also their understanding of athlete activism. And then more into the topic that we'll be discussing today, the micro level, when we think about issues of athlete activism and then individual social responsibility, which was the topic of my PhD dissertation, really looking at, the notion, the idea of whether Black athletes have this responsibility to speak up, given the history of Black athletes and the role that they've played historically in the civil rights movement, dating back to the 1960s, even before, and then even in the present day. So which brings me to the topic, right, of this whole idea of Black athletes and activism, and kind of I want to talk about then and now, and I'm going to go through a number of waves of activism that we've seen throughout time. And I discussed this in a more recent article that was published in Organization, and I interviewed critical sports journalist Dave Zirin, and we kind of we discussed this idea of sport as a site for social change, particularly as it pertains to race. So if we look back and we think about wave one, as you can see right here, early 1900s to 1945, this was characterized by, as you see right there, individual athletes such as Jack Johnson, who was a boxer, Apollo Robeson, a football player, and then Joe Louis, a boxer, and then also individual leagues such as the Negro Leagues and then HBCUs. And essentially these individuals and leagues at the time, they just wanted to fight for recognition and legitimacy within the larger scheme of sports and society as a whole. Then we transitioned to wave two, which was the 1946 to the early to mid 1960s. And I really think about this this wave as, breaking the barrier. That's why I've highlighted names such as Jackie Robinson at Thea Gibson, a graduate of an HBCU. So then we moved to wave three, which was fueled by the civil rights movement and the rise of Black power. And I want to even go back to this picture before on the left right there. To the left, you see Bill Russell, then Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown there in the center, and then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then known as Lew Alcindor. And they were supporting Muhammad Ali at the time for his refusal to be drafted into the military. So if we go back to wave three, these athletes were demanding dignity and respect and social justice. You think about the 1968 Olympics, right? Consider how Harry Edwards, who formed the that Office for Civil Rights and Justice, or something of that sort, Olympic Project for Civil Rights and Justice at the time. And he's the one that organized Tommie Smith and John Carlos. If you think about that picture that we still see today of Tommie Smith and John Carlos holding up their fists at the Olympic stand, he's the one that organized that. And this was a monumental moment in 1968. And it was kind of interesting because at the time they were kind of, they were kicked out of the Olympics, right? But now they're looked at as heroes. And you fast forward to 2016, 2017, Colin Kaepernick, who's been, he's been out the league, he hasn't been able to get a job. So you wonder in 50, 60 years, are we going to look at Colin Kaepernick differently than many people look at him now, in the same way that we look at John Carlos and Tommie Smith today? So then we had this period of stagnation. So from the 1970s to early 2010s, we didn't really see a lot of Black male athlete activism or activism in general coming from athletes. And this was because of some modest changes that we saw, inclusion that we saw among these professional sports leagues, college leagues. So we had USC, I talk about this in my dissertation. There was a running back by the name of Sam Cunningham. So the West Coast integrated before, down south and other places, right? And USC had this running back named Sam Cunningham, and they played Alabama, who hadn't integrated yet. And Sam Cunningham, he just ran all over Alabama. And it wasn't until then that Bear Bryant at the time, he was like, go get me one of them boys, and then all of a sudden now we see a different landscape in the SEC as opposed to what we saw in the 1960s. But outside of that, we really didn't see a number of activists. There was Craig Hodges, who in 1991, who was calling for a boycott of the NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls and the LA Lakers. He came to Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and said, let's boycott because of the shooting of Rodney King that year in Los Angeles. We had Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, who didn't want to stand for the national anthem in the NBA. I think this was around 1994, 1995. But outside of that, there's not many cases of athlete activism. So this is a period of, O.J. Simpson, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, not wanting to, I guess, offend anybody that was gonna, maybe buy their shoes or buy into their brand, and they didn't want to impact their brand. So William Rowan, who I had a chance to meet 2009 at a conference, he had written a book, The $40 Million Slaves, and he talked about this time and how Black athletes have abdicated their responsibility in their community with treasonous vigor. It's a quote as well that I went back to, I had to go get for my dissertation, because it talks about the Black athlete during this time period and how they were just different from time period before, and how money and other factors really played into this. And then wave 4, 2014 to the present. I say 2014 because think back to what happened in that year was Trayvon Martin. And that infamous picture again of the Miami Heat that they took with us coaches as well, with the hoodies on in remembrance of Trayvon Martin. And then since then, we've seen a number of different athlete activism come to the forefront again, like we saw many decades ago. And this was, as you see right there, in response to the unjustified killings and treatment of Black Americans by police officers. We have a number of examples such as LeBron James, Colin Kaepernick, and also a number of WNBA players such as, her name is blanking on me right now. She plays for the Minnesota Lynx, but she went above and beyond, I believe, and she actually, she took up criminal justice reform, and she was able to help get this guy out of prison, Jonathan Irons, I believe his name is, and she took, a couple seasons off of the WNBA. So what's different about these athletes as opposed to those that existed, that engaged in athlete activism many decades ago, was that these individuals are looked at more as like mini corporate entities. They are their own business in their own right. So for instance, in the paper that I published, I think it was in 2011, in the Journal of Management Inquiry, I referenced a line that Jay-Z said in one of his songs. He says, "I'm not a business man, I am a business man," and I relate that to athletes as well. today's athletes, when we think about these big time athletes such as LeBron James, Serena Williams, Venus Williams, Colin Kaepernick, and others. So there's a number of questions that arise as a result of this, I guess, these athletes, again, finding their voice with regard to athlete activism. So they're realizing the power. So how should they use it? What ways can they use it? Well, what different ways can they use it as opposed to what happened decades ago? There's also questions of duality. So they have this platform and this privilege to be able, they have resources, a considerable amount of more resources than what activists decades ago had, like such as John Carlos and Tommy Smith. But they're also Black in the United States of America, and as we've seen on occasion, there was a basketball player for the Milwaukee Bucks. He was getting something at CVS in Milwaukee, and I think he had double parked, and he comes out and he's surrounded by 10 police officers and is taken down or whatever. And we saw another case of, I think, can't remember his first name, but Blake, a tennis player who was, taken down in New York. So just because these people are rich and have money doesn't mean that they're not going to experience the same things as other Black and brown people do. So there's this notion, this question of how they navigate that, and then also expectations and responsibility. And it's a question I'd really like to discuss with the larger group is, do Black athletes have a responsibility given their history of speaking up and speaking out with regard to racial justice and equality? And how is that different from maybe white athletes? There's my friend Dave Zirin, the sports journalist. He recently wrote an article in The Nation, the magazine that he writes for. It's saying that it's time for white athletes to speak up. You've seen a few in the NBA do it more recently, but they really haven't taken a stand or been standing with their Black brothers and sisters over these last few years, whenever we've seen this resurgence of athlete activism. And then lastly, navigating internal and external pressures from their team. So Dallas Cowboys, I grew up in Dallas and I'm a Cowboys fan. And you think about Jerry Jones, who said back in, after Trump had made that comment about calling players SOBs, and he said, my players will stand. They will stand for the anthem. So how do you navigate that? And then there's also the external pressures of the fans. There's been athletes who have spoken up and they lost corporate dollars. They've had sponsorships taken away from them. So how do you navigate that? So then over the course of my 10 years in academia, I recently formed this company, this consulting company, 68th Street. I had a chance to meet John Carlos a few years ago. And he inspired the name because of that, what they did at the 1968 Olympics. So basically, I just consult with individual athletes or anybody for that matter that kind of wants to lead movements, lead change, and also organizations, and help them with this process of making their organization more racially diverse and inclusive, and not only looking at inclusivity, but asking the question, what are we including them into, as opposed to, we can include them, but if it's a culture of white supremacy, it's not really doing them it's not doing Black and brown people, it's not doing right by them. So we interrogate these questions in my conversations with them, and I utilize a design thinking and qualitative approach to come to better understand number of questions that I have for them, and that we wrestle together as we come up with solutions for the organization. So that is it. So now open to any questions that you guys may have, or discussion about this whole topic of athlete activism.
So if you don't have a question, I will. So it's more fun if you all have a question. So.
Well, I have a question, right? So I am familiar with William C. Rowland's work. I got to meet him a couple years back as well. And one of the things that he talked about in his text, $40 Million Slaves, was that he felt that the for example, we talked about the Negro Leagues, right? And how having an independent Black baseball organization, even though it was based on racial apartheid, created an industry for the Black community. And in your research, have you found any Black athletes who have kind of talked about branching out and creating their own sports league?
Yeah, it's been a topic of conversation a lot lately, as we've seen, I guess, Black athletes growing tired of the power that these owners do have, particularly when we speak about the NFL. So there's been talks of people, you know, like think about Ice Cube, right? You know, he started his own league. Kyrie Irving, he had brought up thoughts about starting their own league or branching off and being their own bosses. So I don't think it's far-fetched. I think it's definitely there's some potential there. And if things keep on going like the way they're going, I don't see it outside the realm of possibility within our lifetime, at least. Maybe not within the next few years, but within our lifetime.
So just to look at that question of, you know, do Black athletes have an obligation to use their platform to speak out about social justice issues or police brutality or encourage voting or whatever the topic of the day is? I mean, the short answer I would say is yes, but at the same time, I mean, don't all Black people, regardless of if they're athletes, like myself as a teacher, have an obligation? And then like going to white people, in the NBA, you see this, it seems like you see this a little bit more, you know, white athletes speaking out about this, about the injustice, about police brutality. And, you know, you have to wonder, is it because of the fact that you're a white athlete playing in a sport that is, I don't know, I'd say 80% Black? Because I was just reading actually a Yahoo article yesterday about baseball. A baseball player, a Black baseball player, said that the Major League Baseball is not Black enough, and he wasn't talking about the percentage of Black people that play. He was talking about how he told a story to his teammates about being racially profiled, and then it dawned on him that his teammates, they just couldn't, that story didn't resonate with him. And he told that story thinking that, like, you know, all people would understand, especially my teammates would understand that, you know, this kind of thing happens all the time. It's not just a one-off instance, but he was kind of surprised at the reaction, or maybe lack of reaction, from his teammates. So I don't know if that, you know, answers the question at all, but it definitely just gives something to think about in terms of how each sports league goes about, you know, addressing this. Because Colin Kaepernick was vilified a couple of years ago, and now, you know, you see him in commercials, and it's just, you know, I mean, it's not that hard to figure out why that you know, the public opinion has changed. And so now, like you said, now he's looked at more as a hero as opposed to a villain.
Well, it depends on who you ask still.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure. So, I mean, I think Nike definitely saw an opportunity, a marketing opportunity. So we saw that when that commercial came out for them, for Nike, their stock went down, but it was only short-lived, and then their stock rose considerably in the days after that. But when we think about white athletes, you know, I even posed this question to my class. I'm teaching a class right now on leading change, and I had them read that article by Dave Zirin. And then some of the students in the class are former athletes or current athletes that don't play football or basketball. They're like lacrosse or volleyball. Many of them are white, and they speak on their own experience, and they say one of the reasons why they didn't speak up or they didn't approach their Black teammates is because, and I hear this a lot even from non-athletes, that they were afraid. They were scared of saying the wrong thing. They didn't want to be looked at as ignorant, or they just didn't know what to say, essentially. But I think about athletes like, you know, Chris Long, who played in the NFL for a long period of time. And he even has as a nonprofit, he does work in Africa, but he's been one of the foremost white athletes that I can think of that has spoken up about this. You think about, Kyle Korver in the NBA, who wrote a piece in, the what is it called, the Players Tribune, about why he's chosen this, speak up. But when we think about the NBA versus the NFL, a point that I make, in my book and in conversation with class, the reason why you see it more in the NBA is because the fan bases, a lot of this is driven by the market, as you probably would guess. The NBA's fans are more left-leaning, more young. They're younger. They're in the inner city, as opposed to the NFL, whose fans are all over. But you do find more less fans in the NFL that are going to be younger and left-leaning. So the NBA has more leeway to do those things. And then also, you got to remember that NFL contracts are not guaranteed. So you do something, the NFL, they can cut you right then and there, as opposed to NBA contracts, they're guaranteed. So the NBA athletes feel a little bit more empowered as opposed to the NFL athletes. So those are just a couple of reasons why you do see a little bit more of this among the NBA as opposed to the NFL. And then when you brought up the whole idea, you brought up the point of the MLB. The MLB has has a number of black players, but they're black Latinx players, and they don't have the same experience as a person that's grown up in America. And I even think about myself as a black African. My experiences are much different than a person, a black American who has an experience here of over 400 years, opposed to someone who just came here. My parents just came here in the 1970s and 1980s. So I think those, you think about the NHL too, they got a lot of blowback for not canceling games, but again, it's a league with not a lot of black players, and they've struggled a lot with this whole idea of diversity and racial inclusion, because you are seeing more black people desiring to play hockey. But yeah, all interesting questions. Think about what the late Kobe Bryant said before he unfortunately passed, and he said that you just got to do what's right, regardless of your color. You just got to do what's right. And that's what spurred him later in his career to speak up about these issues. But he took the cue early in his career from Michael Jordan. In a 2000 paper that I wrote, I said that one of the reasons why we see a lack of activism from black athletes was because of Michael Jordan. You remember that commercial, some of you are maybe too young to remember, but he had this commercial, "Sometimes I Dream," and it was "Be Like Mike." And I related that to the athlete activism too. These athletes wanted to be just like Mike when it came to athlete activism. They weren't willing to engage because they saw their hero, the person that they regarded and held in high esteem, not engage in it. So why should I either? And then you have nowadays it's definitely a little bit more. It's easier with social media, and after LeBron James and a number of WNBA players started on that path, we see a lot more of that today. So I think we're going to see more of it in the future.
Could you talk a little bit about QualLab question, your research methodology approach to some of this research, and then also how does your identity as a researcher, what advice do you have for the scholars who are coming up as PhD, EDD, and master students as they think through their own choices?
Yeah, that's a good question. So personally, I had to research something that was really of interest to me and personal, so it wouldn't feel like actual work, right? Because as I research this, I don't feel like I hate doing this. I feel like it's a passion of mine. So I really dig into the work. So get something that you find yourself passionate about is one thing I would suggest. In terms of my approach, I take my cue from what's happening in the world, in and around me. So we see these things happening right now with regard to athlete activism. Of course, it's a really sexy in vogue topic to research now. But I think back to 2010, this was before that last wave. Athlete activism wasn't, nobody was researching it, and come to find out, me researching that was one of the reasons why I wasn't I wasn't looked at for a number of jobs. You know, later in my, some people came to me that were on, you know, committees, and they said, you know, the committee thought that, you know, you researching this was too controversial, you know, all this, you know, different type of things that, you know, we have to deal with as, you know, Black and brown scholars, or depending on what you research. So, you know, definitely keep that in mind, but it goes back to, if you're doing what you find that you're passionate about, it really doesn't matter. It ended up working out for me, right? You know, I'm at Ohio State, or should I be Ohio State University. I'm still, you know, trying to get used to that. But in terms of my approach, I try to make contacts with people within the leagues and organizations, so I have a point of reference to know what's always going on, and try to bridge that gap that we see between research and practice. So with me always having these conversations with people such as Dave Zirin, the journalist, or people within the NBA and the NFL, I have kind of a pulse of what's going on. And I never go into a project assuming that I know the answer. So I think that also comes from my use of design thinking, which really centers the user and really wants to get at the answers collaboratively and with one another, and not just myself coming and maybe utilizing a colonial approach and me giving them the answers. We come to the solution together. So I utilize that in my research and also with my consulting that I do.
Have you or any of your colleagues looked at the, I guess, financial impact and the viewership impact of the NBA taking such a strong stance? You know, have people been turned off to Black Lives Matter being on the court, to the commercials that they're showing? I mean, the NBA has just been really out front about it, like right in your face. So I would assume to some people that makes them offended or turn off the TV. Do you have any, or is there any research out there? I know it's kind of a fluid situation because it's happening right now, but you know, is there anything research on that?
Not sure if there's any research on it as of yet, because like you said, it's kind of fluid and we're still going to see what happens. But I do have colleagues that do social media research, and they look at like different hashtags or things people say. And we do see a lot of people saying, well, I'll never watch a game again, or I'm done with the NBA. But we've been seeing that and hearing that for years, right? Because of the things that NBA players have been doing. And then again, I think those are people that generally aren't NBA fans to begin with. They're generally more conservative leaning. And like I mentioned earlier, the typical NBA fan is a little bit more left leaning and a younger population. So right now it's just tough to study because especially whenever they first came back from the lockdown, because games were happening early in the morning or late morning into the day when people are at work, and then coming back home and the games were already over. So naturally the ratings were down. So the ratings have been down, but we're just not sure as of yet if it's because of the times that the games were being played, or if it's because of, you know, having Black Lives Matter on the court, having the messages on their jerseys, Black Lives Matter, and different messages that they've been allowed to have since the restart. So I think it's going to take some time for all that to kind of, you know, figure itself out. But I mean, of course, yeah, you do see, you know, people saying those things on Twitter or just in conversations. And, you know, I even had a student in my class on our discussion board when we were talking about this. He was like, well, last I checked, the NBA is not a political organization. And he just kind of went on this whole spiel and was basically just talking points from Fox News. So just, but yeah, so we do see that kind of thing. And I'm sure we will see it, continue to see it, even in the NFL, because the NFL is saying that they're going to be more, I guess, in their words, progressive with regard to racial justice and equality after Roger Goodell's apology to Colin Kaepernick, saying that they handled that thing wrong.
I wanted to ask about the macro level of your analysis, but in application to educational organizations. What should universities do? I mean, places like Ohio State had, pride themselves on long athletic tradition, and they recruit students of color and white students in their high-profile football and basketball programs. And so Ohio State is very proud of that. What should the universities do? How would they participate in encouraging activism of their student athletes? Or, I mean, the answer I'm looking forward is not to be afraid of student activism, but we know that universities encourage student leadership, but they're afraid of student activism. So my question is about student activism specifically.
Yeah, we know that college athletics, particularly when we think about men's basketball and football, it's a business now. It's essentially, semi-pro or pro, just like, the other leagues. And these athletes are muzzled for the most part. They really, there's a lot of fear out there to speak on these issues from an athletic standpoint, from the athletes, because one, they fear retribution from maybe getting their scholarship taken away, or they fear not being able to go to the next level and being drafted or being looked at as a non-team player. So one of the things that I've talked about, and I had a Zoom webinar with a few coaches recently. I said they have to lead by example themselves. They have to do a better job of understanding these issues, not allow it to just be an issue for Black and brown people or Black athletes. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. A couple weeks ago, LSU, a number of my former students at LSU, football guys, they held a protest, and they did a walk on campus. And in other cases with other teams, their coach was with them. But in this case, Coach O was not with them. And I was like, that's interesting. Like, why is the coach not with them? But if you flash back a few weeks before, Coach O was on Fox News saying how President Trump had done such an amazing job and how he was just great and this and that. And it turns out that Coach O didn't know about the protests. So I was talking to one of my former students, and like, everybody's giving Coach O crap and this and that, but he didn't know. I was like, well, there's a reason why he didn't know. He's lost trust of his athletes after he had said that. And now he said that he didn't know that Black people were experiencing this. He's just a football guy, and he had no idea about the experience of Black people in America. So when I talk to, executives or coaches or leaders, I say, it's incumbent on you to, understand these issues, whether you're an athletic director or somebody in the senior staff. You have to become more knowledgeable and understand these issues so you can lead by example and give your athletes the kind of trust that we didn't see in that LSU case. And I think if we see more of these leaders, corporate leaders, athletic leaders, speaking up, not only speaking up, but actually doing as they say, I think we'll see a lot more athletes feeling more open about their activism, because after George Floyd was killed, we saw a number of corporate CEOs, we saw a number of statements that came out, we support Black Lives Matter, yada, yada, yada. But shortly after, we saw a number of these employees within those same companies saying, no, this is not the case. If Black Lives mattered, you wouldn't have fired so-and-so, or you wouldn't have had this an inclusive culture within this organization. So it's really up to these leaders kind of, set the tone.
Also, I don't know, I don't want to continue asking questions, but does anyone else have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So just kind of the veggie back really quick. When you were talking about the eras of the different Black athletes and activism, you mentioned Joe Louis. And I thought that was rather peculiar, because many people argue that Joe Louis and the way he handled himself in the media, in public, was representative of respectability politics because of the ire that Jack Johnson drew in terms of his unapologetic blackness and, you know, of course, going around with white women, etc. So I just want to know if you could kind of maybe highlight why you included Joe Louis in terms of someone that was considered a Black activist.
Yeah, so I think there's different ways you can think about activists, right? So activists, especially in that day, doesn't have to deal with, you know, maybe holding a press conference or speaking on these issues, but activists can be something as small as taking on a white athlete who is, or going to Germany, right? And during that time and fighting and winning and overcoming the odds. And when we think about the thought about a Black athlete at the time, that they couldn't do certain things. So it's more so about them competing on a level that they weren't expected to compete on, and not as opposed to them kind of being at the forefront or leading a protest or, you know, things like that. Is more so in that way, just about being in the same space as these white athletes at the time. And as we move forward, when the athletes, Black athletes, got that space and got that legitimacy, I don't think those, of course, those same type of acts wouldn't be considered activist feats nowadays. Right. That makes sense.
Okay.
So I just wanted to bring into the conversation about athletes attending HBCUs. We definitely see a trend in that, or very recent trend in that in the past, like I would say a couple of months. Yeah. I'm sure you're familiar, you know, with Jamil Hill. She wrote about, you know, I think it was specifically highly recruited basketball and football players going to HBCUs to bring money to those institutions. And she got a lot of pushback as being, I believe some people went as far to call her racist, which is crazy in my opinion, but it did happen. And so I'm just curious, you know, what are your thoughts on that in terms of, you know, for example, like that the football example at LSU you gave, if those students were at an HBCU, most likely the coach would have been aware, would have attended. A little bit different in the SEC. You know, you see Tommy Tuberville, I believe, is running for congressman in Alabama now after coaching, I think at Auburn. So, you know, it's a little bit different. You know, the SEC is kind of a political organization of itself when it comes to football, especially. So I'm just curious, you know, your thoughts on that. You know, trying to encourage Black athletes as young as high school to use their platform, their bodies to send a message to the power structure. You know, how do you think that's effective? You know, what would have to happen for it to become, I guess, more effective?
Yeah, that is a trend that we've seen more recently, as you alluded to, particularly in basketball. And I think it's easier to do in basketball just because if you can get a couple few to go to a school, that can transform the whole entire team, make it to the tournament, you know, all the dollars that, you know, I mean, the NCAA tournament, it's $1 billion maker. So that can change the fortunes of HBCU just by getting to the tournament. It's a little bit harder to do in football because it's more of a team sport. You need a lot more, you know, pieces in place or whatever. But I think it's great that those athletes did that. If we do see more of that, that can indeed change the power structures that we see within the NCAA to kind of dismantle what we see and experience today within college athletics. But I think more so than the players, I think it's also important to look at the parents, because the parents a lot of times are influencing these decisions. You think about whenever they hold these, you know, press conferences where the player selects the hat of the school that he's going to. In a number of cases, I mean, I think in one case in particular, an athlete chose a Florida hat, and his mom, Black mom, was pissed off that he chose Florida as opposed to going to Alabama, and it's all because she felt that Alabama would give him the better opportunity to make it to the NFL. So it's not just the kids, it's the parents too that you have to consider, because the parents are the ones that these coaches are going to their homes and speaking to. So if we can kind of influence the parents, I think we can see a lot more of what we've seen in recent months of these students going to HBCUs in order to change the landscape that we see today.
There's so much more I want to talk about. I want to share with you all a couple things in terms of moving forward. But first, I would like to ask us all to thank Dr. Agyemang and congratulate him for the amazing, just lifelong work that you've been doing and the importance that it holds moving forward today with the scholar strike, certainly both here in the US and Canada, but also moving forward, how important it is. So thank you. I do want to quickly mention the next series that we have coming up is combination between Ed Studies. I'm working with Lori Patton Davis and the QualLab to bring you this series of OSU alums who will talk about unapologetic educational research addressing anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy. So we hope you join us for that. It's on our website, and Bakari is working hard on getting us webinars going through OSU, big red tape. And then with the QualLab lunches, we have more for the series, certainly. And we also have a grad student board that is starting with Chelsea and Bakari, working to make sure that your voice, what you want to see happen with the QualLab, happens, as well as to give you opportunities to actually engage in research yourself if you're interested in working on research projects, and there's more to come. So I want to ask us all to say thank you, pay attention to time, but then also invite people, as we would if we were in person, to stick around, ask more questions of Dr. Agyemang and each other as well. So I thank you for taking time to come today and for helping us launch the very first QualLab Lunch. It was such a great series last year. I know you all asked for it to continue. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So please stay on if you would like, or drop off. But we hope to see you again at the events all year long. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad. Let's just chat, as you would if you were still in the room together.
That was good. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
I'm looking forward. I saw you're bringing